everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Event Insights. I'm Chrissy with Safe Events Global, and joining me today I have Emergency and Crisis Management Specialist John Brophy. John, how are you?
I'm very good, Chrissy, and thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to all your lovely subscribers and listeners and all the rest.
Of course. So John has worked with our team quite a bit over the years. He has done tabletop exercises with us and worked a lot in a lot of the emergency and crisis pre-planning for the events that we work on. Our team have always found it so helpful and so insightful. So we figured that this is the kind of knowledge we want to share with the industry. As John is going through his presentation here, if you have any questions, just pop them into the Q&A section there on the right-hand side of the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So John, in the meantime, I'll hand it over to you.
Very good, Chrissy. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I'm just going to share a screen here, if you bear with me for 1 second, and hopefully the technology that we've checked a few minutes ago will work. So you should see that screen there perfect. Now. Excellent. Thanks, Chrissy. I'm going to talk to you folks about emergency and crisis management, and I'll explain the difference between those two and other levels of contingency planning. And really what I'm trying to drive at here with people is to get you to ask yourselves the question, how prepared are you actually, or is your organization for responding to unplanned, unforeseen interruptions or incidences that can threaten people's lives? So just by brief way of introduction, as Chrissy has said, I kind of specialize. I'm 50% of a massive company called Brophy. The other guy is Noel Reedy. And I suppose our bread and butter business really is running exercises. So we design training exercises. I don't know what your experience of exercise is, but our view on it is exercises are an opportunity to practice management teams in responding to adverse events, or practice them in implementing their contingency plan. So a lot of organizations, particularly for people like yourselves involved in the event management industry and a lot to do with health and safety, there's good plans in place. Whether people have read them, how familiar they are with them, how often do they get the chance to implement them, that all needs to be practiced. It's unreasonable, basically, to expect that you can have an effective response if you haven't practiced people in doing so. So we would work across all industry sectors, private sector, public sector. There are frameworks for major emergency management and strategic emergency management in practically all of the Western European jurisdictions. Certainly we have it here in Ireland, they have it in the UK, and in a lot of other jurisdictions, there's very well developed emergency management procedures at state level and that. So I'll talk to you about emergencies versus crisis, just to distinguish between the two, because they're different animals really, although they're closely related, obviously. I'll talk you briefly through the approach that's taken here in Ireland, which is a systems approach to contingency management. Now, that systems approach can be applied to both emergency and crisis management, and it's not that complex. It's just 5 phases that run on a loop, if you like, or continuous basis, and I'll show you what that is. I'll talk to you about what happens when something goes wrong, because when you come under very close scrutiny, as you will in a crisis or an emergency or a major emergency or major incident, as some of you might call it, people's reputation and the reputation of the organization that you represent can be destroyed. And people don't always have an accurate picture of what that is. So we need to talk about the perception that Joe Public, if you like, has about what happens and how you need to get your side of the story out. I talk to you about the basics of what should be in emergency management structures and crisis management structures and arrangements, which is basically what your plan should contain. So the objectives of any plan should be to outline the structures and arrangements, not to control. You can't control anything that happens through a plan, like obviously it's only a piece of paper. And I talk to you briefly about the importance and the critical importance, I would say, of training and exercises to develop people's competencies, skills, attitude, and experience in the area of responding when something goes awry. Okay. And as Chrissy has said, we'll maybe take questions at the end. So I'm going to jam a bit on transmit. Now, I'm going to talk fairly quickly, and I want to bring you through a number of slides. So for my sins, I did a master's in emergency management a number of years ago in DCU, and I do a bit of lecturing on that program on the fundamentals of emergency management since about 2012. So every year I keep a slideshow when I see an incident that has occurred or a disaster that has occurred somewhere. I try and capture it. Now, obviously, I don't get everything that happens. I'm hitting it in patches, really. I think last year, by the 31st of December, I had 154 slides, something like that. There's one. So 1st of January, crisis major incidences don't take breaks, folks. All right. They're 24/7, 365. So and usually my first slide covers an incident that has happened at an event somewhere at midnight on New Year's Eve, be it fireworks starting a fire, be it a crowd stampede as fireworks go off and people are killed. Here's one this year from Japan, where there was 48 people killed in a New Year's Eve earthquake, and tsunami warnings across, as you can see if you look at the little graphic or picture on the right-hand side, all along that kind of northern or northwestern coast. And you can see the physical damage caused to the buildings. So that in itself is a tragedy. Now, the following day, during the response phase, this incident here occurred. So that's a commercial airliner that was landing in Tokyo Haneda Airport, and it actually collided with a Coast Guard, a small aircraft containing Coast Guard personnel that were flying out to provide relief to people affected by the earthquake. This passenger aircraft collided with it and ignited, and you can see the extent of the damage. Now, I'm going to tell you, everybody was safely evacuated from that aircraft. Now, think about that. That doesn't happen by accident. Why did everybody, or how come everyone was able to get off that? Well, I'll tell you, because the crew were well trained, they were well drilled, there were very clear procedures, and they were practiced in how to implement those procedures. And everybody was evacuated safely from that aircraft, which is incredible when you look at the damage and the intensity of that fire. Imagine jet fuel burning, kerosene, basically. 3rd of January. Now, you needn't worry, I'm not going to bring you through every day of the year. There were 2 explosions at a commemoration for the man you see in the center of the picture on the top right, General Soleimani, who was an Iranian general that was killed in a US airstrike in Iran a couple of years ago in 2020. So he was the head of the overseas operations of Hezbollah. And at his funeral, there was a stampede. So you can see the number of people that turned out at his funeral. There was a crowd stampede that also killed 56 people. So that's an example of one incident that leads to another incident that leads to another incident, etc., etc. Okay, so hundreds of people killed as a result of one individual dying in separate but related incidents. We'll talk about the domino effect in a little while. Now, you'll all be familiar with pictures similar to those. There's no doubt that weather patterns are changing. Flooding is an extreme problem and very difficult to deal with. And while you can have a flood plan, people completely underestimate the power and the danger associated with water. People forget that 1 cubic meter of water weighs 1 metric ton. That is 1,000 kilograms, folks, okay? And water moving at any speed at all, a couple of meters per second, halfway between your ankle and your knee, will knock you off your feet, as they say. It'll lift cars. Again, if you look at flood water, is filthy. I mean, there's all sorts, there's sewage, there's chemicals, there's all sorts of stuff. And there's always the idiot in the shark suit who wants to go for a swim to get his picture on the newspaper, okay? So floods are extremely dangerous, and we'll probably see more flooding rather than less. And flooding historically has killed millions and millions of people, basically. I think it's second in terms of danger to earthquakes, actually, okay? Now, I know many of you are event managers, and I just said I put this one in. This is a cruise ship, obviously. This was a cruise ship that was bound for Hawaii. There were almost 2,000 people, 3,000 people, I beg your pardon, on board. So, cruise ships are like small towns in their own right, and they're like an event all of the time, because there's entertainment things that go on them. People are living in very close quarters. So you can imagine when there's an illness that crops up. Now, this is only one. I could have shown you another cruise ship where they were quarantined because there were suspected 24 cases of cholera on board. And again, you may remember back at the start of COVID when there was outbreaks on cruise liners and whatever, and they weren't allowed to dock and disembark passengers, etc. 12th of February in Romania, they had something similar to what we had here in Ireland a couple of years ago when the HSE was hacked with ransomware, and 18 hospitals lost access as a result of a cyber attack to all of their medical reports. Now, you see a headline like that, and you don't really think about what that means. So you can imagine if you're a patient or you're a consultant or a doctor in a hospital, and you cannot access any patient information. So nurses don't know what medications patients are on, because a lot of stuff now is digitized. There are digital medical records for people. Obviously, their National Cyber Security Center was activated in response. So that attacks like that have dramatic effects, and they attack vulnerable people and lead to deaths of vulnerable people. Here's one from March in Moscow, 23rd, that you'll be familiar with again and again. You know, it's a terrorist attack. And where did it target? Terrorist attacks oftentimes target the transportation sector, or they'll target a particular event where there's a condensed number of people. So what they would call a target-rich environment from their own perspective. Now, again, you can see I'm categorizing these in the little black box there at the top. So that's civil. That's a civil. War, terrorism is a civil type of incident. And I'll explain the categories to you as we go through it. But again, 145 people killed in that particular incident. And the picture in the middle, as you can see there, some of these terrorist attacks now, like the one in New Zealand, Christchurch a few years ago, they're live streamed, like, you know, almost like they're meant to be some aspect of entertainment or streamed to highlight somebody's particular cause. Now, you'll all be familiar with the picture on the right-hand side there. That's the bridge in America that collapsed after a ship strike, and there were 6 people, workers on the bridge, unfortunately killed. The 6th person's body was only recovered yesterday, actually. But what a lot of people missed out on was there was a very similar, almost the exact same incident happened in Beijing in China back in February, where the red kind of vessel that you see there struck a bridge in Beijing, causing the midsection to collapse, and 5 vehicles that happened to be on that bridge that time fell in. 3 of them fell into that ship, and there were 5 people killed in that particular incident. Now, those bridges would be regional critical infrastructure. So the problems that causes traffic-wise when you have major arterial routes are manifest. Like, for example, for those of you that might be familiar with Dublin, if you're traveling on the M1 or M50 network, if there's an accident on that network at peak traffic times, traffic will back up at 1 kilometer per minute. So in 10 minutes, you'll have a 10-kilometer tailback. And again, that causes all sorts of logistical issues for businesses and that. Now, I'm not getting into the whole war scenario. The 2nd of April was an interesting date because there were 2 concurrent incidents that happened. There was large-scale international condemnation because 7 charity workers were killed in what was alleged to be a targeted strike by Israel on 3 vehicles that were in the Gaza Strip, all of which had the logo of the charity, as you can see in the picture on the left, on the roof. And there was a big outcry. Not that there wasn't an outcry about what's going on in Gaza prior to that. And on the same date, Iran vowed revenge for a strike on its consulate in Damascus in Syria, in which 2 of its generals were killed and 5 other people killed along with that. So there was fears of major escalation in the Middle East. And as we know, Iran did retaliate and Israel retaliated to that. And I'll talk about escalation in a couple of minutes, okay? There's one from the 13th of April in Sydney. Now, I have a daughter myself in Sydney, and when I saw this, I got a bit of a shock, I have to say. I thought it was a terrorist attack, but it turns out it was a guy with mental health issues, and he randomly stabbed a number of people, largely targeting females, and killed 6 people. And that police officer you see in the picture shot him dead in self-defense, basically, and saved many people's lives. So again, you get an incident like this, and it's instant, it's global, it's social media coverage, and there's almost live CCTV of it. There's another transportation or affecting transport, but it's a natural hazard that caused it. So there was 120 meters of rainfall in 12 or 24 hours in Dubai, which obviously is a major international hub. And that caused cancellation of hundreds of flights, and you have thousands and thousands of people who are stranded. You have all the issues associated with flooding, and, you know, the knock-on effect of that lasts for a couple of weeks, like, you know. Those of you who are familiar with this, so this is one that relates specifically to an incident in Ireland that happened on St. Valentine's Day in 1981, where there was a fire in a nightclub in North County Dublin, and 48 people lost their lives in that fire, which spread rapidly, and it took 43 years to get a formal, proper inquiry that the families had been agitating and for decades. So just after the 43 years anyway, in all 48 cases, there was unlawful death. Now, this is one of the things I want to highlight to you. When there's a major incident or major emergency, or there's a mass fatality incident, while there's the emergency response part, which is the immediate response, the recovery period for incidents like that lasts not for weeks or months or years, but decades. Okay, and court cases and litigation can go on for decades. And that's a topic I'll come back to in a little while. So when you're developing your plans, you need to make sure they're effective, because, you know, you will, if you're involved in some way in the development of a plan or the management of an incident and there's a fatality, there will certainly be an inquiry and you will be asked the question, this was a known risk or hazard. What did you do to ensure you were prepared to manage it effectively? And that's a tough question to answer. We obviously have the wars that are ongoing in both Ukraine and Gaza, and you could do a separate slideshow on those. Now, there's a reason I'm just briefly talking you through those. I'm trying to highlight to people disasters, emergencies, crises, incidences are happening all day, every day. Somewhere in the world, there's a mass fatality event, more than whatever number of people being killed. There are no exemptions, folks. So just because it hasn't happened here recently does not mean we can prevent everything from occurring. We can't. Now, if you think about that, right? If you think about that, you will make sure that you have a plan and that you have people with the relevant knowledge, experience, and competencies managing your events or running your business or in a position to respond as part of your service or organization. Okay, so think about that. Now, here's a question for you. I don't need an answer to this question, obviously, but ask yourself, what is the reasonable worst case scenario in terms of an emergency or crisis that could strike your organization or could strike an event that you would be running? What is the reasonable worst case scenario? And once you have picked that, ask yourself the following question. Would your current contingency plans ensure that you have a timely, effective, and coordinated response? Now, if you don't have a plan that's well developed and has been practiced, you will not be able to answer that question to your own satisfaction. I know what I'd like to be able to say to that. So training, exercise, preparedness, it all feeds into the answer to that question. Now, I've mentioned contingency. Contingency plans are emergency, incident, crisis, business continuity. They're all aspects of contingency, right? And a contingency is merely an event or incident that may or may not occur. That's the definition. So a contingency is a plan for something that might happen, all right? There's no such thing as a perfect plan. You could be waiting for years trying to perfect a plan. And there's a great saying by General Patton from World War II, a good plan violently executed today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow. Okay? There is no perfect plan. So don't look for perfection. Your plans should be evolving constantly as you identify lessons and then change the plan or tweak it to make sure that lesson is learned and reflected in the written procedure. Now, we could get into this in detail, but generally speaking, there are 3 levels of contingency plan generally. So you have the emergency plan, which be the basic plan. The building catches fire. What's the procedure? The alarm goes off. We evacuate, avoiding the lifts, use the stairs. There's an assembly area. There's a head count. There's an accounting for people. There's somebody in charge of the site liaising with the emergency services, and they do their thing when they hear that everybody is out or not, okay? The next level is business continuity planning. Now, that has evolved quite rapidly over a number of years, which started off as IT disaster recovery planning. So we developed dependencies on information technology. If our systems went down, we needed an alternative workspace with access to servers where we could recover back to whatever point in time we had decided. So there are 2 aspects. There are business critical operations that are non-technical, okay? Sales, payroll, the ability to collect money, remuneration, etc., etc. And there's the technical side, which we'll call for the purpose of our IT disaster recovery. And then there's crisis management. And crisis, some people regard these as bronze, silver, and gold level plans, the crisis management being the gold level. Others would call them strategic, operational, and tactical. It's just different levels. The crisis management plan is your kind of all-in, where you have a team that oversee all the contingency plans and manage the external relations and reputation of the business. So the other terms I want to distinguish between are hazard, risk, and threat, because you see them a lot in contingency plans. A hazard is a potential source of harm. That's it, right? To an individual, a community, a group, setting, whatever the case may be, a potential source of harm. And you can categorize hazards. I'll show you that in a few minutes. A risk is the likelihood that that hazard will materialize, multiplied by the consequences if it should happen. And the consequences can be measured in different ways. The death of people. How many people would an incident like that kill? Economic costs, damage to the environment, etc. Social cost if it's a societal thing. And a threat is something separate. Again, that is similar to risk, but it's measured in terms of intent to cause harm multiplied by the capability to do so. So, for example, think of a schoolboy prank in a phone box, ringing a premises, giggling and saying there's a bomb in the building and hanging up, versus somebody ringing, identifying an organization, stating a cause and saying there's a bomb threat. You know, the level, the intent and capability have to be measured. So if you know who the organization are, you'll be able to do an estimate in terms of, or the police and intelligence services can determine what the level of that threat is. So it's important to understand those distinctions. Now, what's an emergency? Basically, you can look up Google, you get millions of answers to this, but I'll show you two brief ones. A current unforeseen or unplanned event or incident that has life-threatening or extreme loss implications and requires your immediate attention. It's now, it's unforeseen, you didn't plan to have it. It could do extreme damage to people or financial loss or loss of business, etc., etc. So you need to deal with it here and now. There's a second one, an abnormal adverse event requiring immediate attention, and if it's left unchecked, it could escalate to a crisis. Okay? Again, the key words there, it's abnormal. Doesn't happen all the time. You're not used to it. It's adverse. It's bad. If you don't fix it, it could do ferocious damage. Okay? And get worse. Now, emergencies are fairly well understood. So we have emergency services. Like, there is such a thing as a normal emergency, I'm sorry to say. A house fire or a small road traffic accident with a single fatality, incidents like that, policing incidents, etc., etc. So they're generally well managed. They're well planned for the normal emergency. It's when things escalate and get to a stage where the resources are overwhelmed, we're into major incidents and major emergencies. Now, a crisis is a different animal from an organizational perspective. So a crisis is defined as a low probability, high impact event that can threaten the existence of the organization. So it may put you out of business completely, or that you be vulnerable and bought over by somebody else or whatever, or that and that is characterized. Now, characterized. So this will happen by ambiguity of cause, effect, and means of resolution. So it's unclear what's causing it, particularly in the early stages. It's unclear what damage it's going to do, again, particularly in the early stages. And it's certainly unclear what you can do to prevent it from getting worse, again, particularly in the early stages, okay? And by an urgency, that decisions need to be made here and now. And the challenge of crisis management is decision-making and action planning in the absence of critical information. So you may be forced to make an assumption, and you will have to review any assumption that you make, and you may be forced to change the decision that you took. Managers do not like, senior leadership do not like doing that. They're not used to making U-turns on the basis of fresh information. Okay? Now, there are 5 other characteristics of a crisis. The first one is it always gets worse. So when you get, say you're a member of a crisis management team and you get activated to say something has happened, before that team gets control on that crisis, it will worsen. Now, you need to understand that to know that that's normal in a crisis. Secondly, it'll come under very close scrutiny of both the media and of government agencies, which will be regulators. So Health and Safety Authority, for example, or the Environmental Protection Agency, okay? regulatory bodies. Thirdly, it's a crisis. Operations don't proceed as normal. These are abnormal circumstances and things are going to be different. Fourthly, it will threaten or jeopardize reputations, both of the organization and of the senior leadership, the individuals in charge who would be expected to front up on behalf of that organization. And lastly, it'll cost money. Crises have a financial cost. There may be fines, there may be litigation, there may be physical damage that has to be repaired, etc., etc. There's all sorts of financial cost, and that's often overlooked. Okay, the financial impact on organizations. Now, there's a model that you may be familiar with. It's called James Reason's Swiss cheese model of how disasters or major accidents happen. So each of these slices of cheese, if you like, represents a safety system or mitigation that we would have in place to try and prevent it from occurring. But none of them in their own right is perfect. And on a given day, all those little weaknesses can align and all 3 or 4 redundant systems can fail. And you can have active failures, so somebody makes a mistake, and you can have latent failures, which are failures or weaknesses that are built into systems and procedures that we've had over the years. So it's just a good visual representation of how major incidents can occur despite good planning. Now, this diagram is known as the 5-phase paradigm for major emergency management, actually, but it can be applied to any level of contingency planning. So there are 5 phases to this, and it starts in the blue phase, hazard analysis. So a hazard, any potential source of harm. So we identify all of the potential hazards that could affect us, and without assessing them, just get them all down. Excuse me. The second part of hazard analysis is risk assessment. So having identified all hazards, we then start saying, right, look, anything that's really low likelihood, we don't need to assess further. We do the likelihood and the consequences. Okay, and we focus in on the ones that are more likely or more consequential. The second phase is mitigation. So having identified them, we now put steps in place to reduce either the likelihood that that event will occur or the consequences if it does happen. Okay, so the likes of your people barriers and controlling the numbers of people in various spaces, the access, the egress flow of people from events that has to be measured, how many can we get out along certain routes, all that stuff is part of mitigation. And the third phase there is planning and preparedness. So developing the written plan, training people to say, this is the plan, this is your role, this is what you're meant to do, here's what might happen, these are the hazards, this is the response plan. And practicing people in responding before something occurs. Okay, and that so that if the flash bang happens, the incident or the hazard materializes, we can implement an effective, timely, and coordinated response in the green phase. And the last phase, as mentioned to you previously, is recovery. Now, recovery is, if I can use the term, the most neglected phase of that, because when you train and exercise, you largely train and exercise people in the response, which is where you can minimize the damage. Whereas the recovery gets into the litigation, the follow-on, the inquiries, the investigations, the blame game, if you like, okay? And that can take decades, as we've seen with the Stardust and, for example, Hillsborough. Now, it's a cyclical process, so it's ongoing. It also can adopt an all hazards approach. So what that means, and it's a term you'll come across a bit in emergency management research and that, it's where the source of the hazard that materialized, the resources that we have to respond are the same for all hazards, basically. So it's still the emergency services that we will be using and the civil defense and possibly the military. So the resources are finite and limited, but they're all in place to address hazards that would materialize. So we don't have specific resources for different, or we'd end up with dozens and dozens of different plans. Now we do have sub plans and that, but an all hazards approach is where it's the same resources responding. And there are 4 categories of hazard. So you have natural hazards, flooding, for example, earthquakes, geological, seismological, biological hazards would just come out of a 1 in 100 year pandemic, for example. You have technological hazards. Chernobyl was a technological disaster, basically. So nuclear is an example of that. Transportation accidents, air, rail, road, sea, and space, more and more so space, okay? And lastly is civil, which would be war, terrorism, civil protest, as we see going on in the universities in America and in Trinity College, etc., industrial unrest, they'd all be civil hazards. So any hazards you can think of will fit into one of those 4 categories or the subcategories associated with them. So now, I've explained what a crisis is, and now I want to talk about, well, what's crisis management and how do you plan to manage a crisis, or what does that involve? And it's defined as a high tempo, high consequence activity that works to very tight deadlines, okay, and requires decisions under conditions of uncertainty, where there's very little scope to wait. There's an urgency. It must be done now. And again, this is where people are taken out of their comfort zone. They're forced to take action and make decisions in the absence of all of the information. Okay. And that means you have to continuously review, tweak, and respond on your feet. And that urgency puts pressure on people. Okay. The urgency to make decisions, because things will get worse the longer we dilly-dally. It's a pre-planned rapid response capability when it's done properly, and has 3 key pillars: leadership, strong leadership, information management, right? So the volume of information, as we saw, things are going to escalate. The volume of information that's flowing about, it snowballs, and it needs to be managed to get an understanding, situational awareness. And the third one is communications capacity, internal and external. Okay, so they're the 3 key pillars of crisis management, if you like. Now, I'm going to show you this slide. If you get this slide, you're 50% of the way to fully understanding a crisis, right? These are characteristic of crisis. So they will manifest if you're in a crisis. It'll come as a shock or a surprise. You don't get a forewarning for a crisis. You may get a forewarning for an emergency. For example, an orange weather alert, a red weather alert. They're abnormal. So you have no frame of reference in a lot of cases, because it's not a scenario you'd have dealt with before. That can cause fear amongst people. There will be confusion, particularly in the early stages. There'll be a lack of information, and in fact, there will probably be conflicting information that you have to sort through to say, where is the actual truth or facts of the matter? What is the factual known situation? There's time pressure, so there's urgency that people aren't used to. There's the escalating flow of events. You can develop a siege mentality as a crisis team. You think the world is out to get you and that everybody is against you, whereas that's not the case. That can cause panic, as I said, all the combination of the factors. There can be a short-term focus to say, well, we'll address the effects, and you don't actually fix the cause, okay? And again, there's a general lack of familiarity unless you have been lucky enough to be practiced in multiple scenarios when you do your training and exercising. So they're characteristic. It's important you know those. They will manifest. Okay. Now, in a crisis, then, the perception, people's perception of, because all crises now and emergencies are public knowledge relatively quickly, if not immediately, right? And people develop their own perception through what they see and what they hear, both in the mainstream media and on their socials more and more. Okay. So they'll form a perception, positive or negative, at a fairly early stage in the response, okay? If your stakeholders, the people who are important to you, think that there's a problem, you have a problem, right? So if they think there's a problem or you're doing something wrong, you need to address that rapidly. Now, there's a great saying by Warren Buffett. He said, it takes 20 years to build a rep. Now, most businesses trade on their reputation. You know what I mean? Because obviously, if you have poor reputation, no one's going to do business with you. So the trust that people put in your brand and that. He said it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to destroy it. And he said, the second part, if you think about that, you will do things differently. You will make sure you put the effort in to protect something that has taken you decades to build. Now, I've just put in a few individuals there and different things in terms of reputation. The man on the left there is David Duckenfield. So that's the police chief inspector who was the event controller, if you like, or the person in charge during the Hillsborough disaster in 1989, where 96 football fans were crushed, as we know. That man was in court in 2019. So there's another instance of a mass fatality event. That man's life was destroyed by that day, obviously, okay? And he was blamed. He became the focus of the blame. You can see the former British PM there, Liz Truss, in the middle, and one of the tabloid newspapers had this ongoing thing with her. They had a head of lettuce wrapped in cellophane. They said the head of lettuce will last longer than Liz Truss, and they claimed that it did. I think she was 42 days in power or whatever, and, her reputation was sullied through a couple of bad decisions around economics. And You have Rudy Giuliani on the left, who went from hero of 9/11 as the mayor of New York to the man you see on the right there with his hair dye running down his face and he under pressure as he was Donald Trump's campaign manager in the last election versus Joe Biden. So he went from kind of hero to almost zero, depending on your point of view. Now, what happens, the court of public opinion is very important. You must win the court of public opinion during a crisis to maintain your reputation. I'm going to show you a number of pictures. Does anyone recognize, I don't know if people can talk, maybe they can't, Chrissy, so I'll talk you through it. Most people look at that picture of the guy in the union and say, oh yeah, I recognize him from somewhere. That's Captain Schettino. He was in charge of the Costa Concordia, the vessel that overturned or capsized and lost 34 lives and thousands of people evacuated, $500 million worth of damage done. And he got a 16-year jail sentence, actually. When I ask people, who was his employer? Think about that. Nobody has ever been able to answer me that question when I do a session like that, right? Because it suited his employer. He basically became the media story very quickly. The second guy there is Dominic Strauss-Kahn. He was head of the World Bank, Frenchman, and he was the favorite for the French presidency until he was arrested getting on an aircraft in New York, having been accused of sexually assaulting a chambermaid in the hotel he stayed in overnight. That third lady there is Elizabeth Holmes. She was the founder of Theranos. We'll come back to that. And the four guys you see on the right were guys that were tried in the Belfast, what became known as the Belfast rape trial. Now, those guys were found not guilty, but that trial was very public. And by day 2 or 3 of that trial, the court of public opinion convicted those guys and said, regardless of how the law finds you, the court of public opinion says what you did was wrong. And those guys lost their jobs. 2 of them were professional rugby players on Irish international contracts and no longer working in the jurisdiction. Now, each of those people are involved with a brand, okay? So Captain Schettino worked for Costa Crociere, okay, who were a subsidiary of a wider group. But nobody can ever answer that question. Dominic Strauss-Kahn, he lost that job, obviously, once he was accused. He was with the World Bank. Elizabeth Holmes, Theranos, that was the blood test with the vial, just claiming that you could do all sorts of tests with just a drop of blood. She became a billionaire very briefly. He's now in jail and Theranos no longer exists. And the IRFU, they disassociated themselves very quickly with those individuals on foot of that trial. So what happens to an organization, when something goes wrong, the media look for a face, to a person to associate. Think of any large incident. If there's a Virgin Media rail crash, Richard Branson will be on the ground first thing in the morning, speaking to the media and offering sympathy to the victims. They look for the head of the organization, and sometimes it suits them to leave people in place because they become the story. So the reputational damage can be individual or can be on the brand or the organization. Now, communications are critical in a crisis. You cannot over-communicate in a crisis, okay? You cannot over-communicate. So it in itself, crisis communications is an entire field and subject in its own right. And it doesn't just mean saying the right thing in a press statement. It's much more than that. Yeah, it's internal and external. It's managing all your stakeholders, and I'll talk about that in a second. Now, if you've done something wrong, you need to put your hands up and say, look, we made a mistake, we did it wrong, we apologize, and here's what we're going to do to fix it. You can't communicate your way out of something you behaved your way into. Now, that was said about Tiger Woods after his indiscretions, when he literally, in the third picture, held a press conference for the world media and had his mother sitting in the front row and apologized to the world and his mother, okay? And this guy said, well, just because you can't communicate your way out of something you did wrong, or you behaved your way into. So the media, most people are afraid of the media, and that's through a lack of training or awareness of how they operate. They're not your enemy. They're certainly not your friend. They will be very quick to tell you how independent they are, and they want both sides of the story. So you must engage with them in order to try to get your side of the story across. And again, in order to do so, you must make sure you have designated, trained spokespersons to talk to and speak to the media when required in a disaster or emergency. Who's going to represent your organization? Now, I said I'd throw these in. Emergency plan must have. This is a summary, basically. It's not exhaustive. I stress that to you. The first thing is you must have a clearly written and concise emergency plan that's based on the risks that are most likely to affect you or most consequential. Okay. That plan should have, for events, for example, an on-site and off-site management structure. So there's a certain structure required, particularly for emergency services, at an incident site where something has gone wrong, structural collapse, fire, flood, whatever. And you need off-site management structures dealing with the stakeholders and the communications aspect. Can't all happen from the site of the incident itself. You need a clear notification and escalation mechanism outlined in the plan. How are you going to notify or be notified of an incident that has occurred? What are the classifications of incident? When do you escalate to the senior leadership team, who then sit as a crisis team? And how are they going to be activated? Inside normal hours and outside normal hours. You need a designated person in charge. So at the incident scene, you need an event controller, for example, as you have in large-scale events. You need a site incident controller for physical incidents that occur if you're on a plant or a manufacturing site or whatever the case may be. Site incident controller. You need a clear structure for the coordination of the response efforts between different agencies. Now, this is something and a key challenge for emergency services. When you have multiple agencies, fire, police, other emergency or blue light service, ambulance service, for example, Coast Guard, when they're all responding to a major incident, you can't have duplication of effort. It'll just add to the chaos and confusion. So there are clearly outlined structures for the coordination of each agency's role, how they meet their role and responsibilities on the ground, who takes the lead at certain stages, etc., etc. And you must have a clear decision-making authority. If you have a team in your organization, right, or if you're outlining the role of an event manager in a plan, what exactly is their decision-making authority? Okay, because if it's not clear and they come under pressure, the first thing they'll do is they'll default to a higher authority, and that delays the process and nobody will make a decision. And you must have trained, experienced personnel in key positions. Trained, experienced personnel. You can have less experienced people shadow them, and they're gaining experience that way. Crisis management plans must have team role. What is the function of the crisis management team? And there's an example. It's to direct, control, and manage the organization's response, both internally and externally. Now, that requires clearly identified team structure with a written mandate, right? And clear roles and responsibilities. Again, a mandate is a decision-making authority without reference to a higher person or higher up the food chain. Okay? Clearly written mandate where possible. You should have core team members and alternate team members, so deputies, and the deputies must be trained to the same extent as the core team. It's unreasonable to expect them to be able to perform if you haven't given them the same training. And all of those people should be practiced in plan implementation through a progressive exercise program over a period of time. 2 years, 3 years, okay? You can build up to a live exercise every 3 years with people. And you must have an information management capability. Trained information management officers who can capture and display information as it comes in, is verified and is processed, and can then be used as the basis for decision making once it's presented to the leadership team. So that is a critical role on a crisis management team. It's not a role for an administrator or a log keeper. That's a more administrative role. This is a mid-manager to senior manager who can process a volume of information, distill it, and present it orally and written to a decision-making team. And again, you must have a clear training and exercise program. Now, I'm almost finished. You'll be delighted to hear. I just want to show you two further things. There's a generic team structure for crisis management. So obviously you'd have a board who are responsible for an organization. The chief executive is usually the executive with executive responsibility for managing the organization on a day-to-day basis. He or she usually will make a decision as to whether they want to lead a crisis management team or sit at one step removed from it and be briefed by the chairperson, which gives them the time and space to prepare for operating as the spokesperson and representing the age, making key phone calls to key stakeholders. The team makeup there, you'd always have the coordinator, who's not necessarily a decision maker, but would be the person that administers the plan and training and would know what the structures and arrangements are, etc. You have a chairperson. Now, you can mix up these roles to match your own organization. Operations, people obviously being a critical part. Finance, technical. So if you're a pharmaceutical, for example, you'd have chemical engineers, etc., and a communications lead. And each of these persons can have a sub-team operating in the background that they delegate tasks to. You need clear kind of dotted line linkage to emergency services and official state agencies such as regulators. And you can have a support team, which would be any specialist that you can co-opt onto the team. There wouldn't be a core team member, but let's say it's a quality issue in a food production business. You would co-opt somebody from quality onto that core team to advise in relation to the food safety aspects. And the third part of it there on the bottom right is, other than your contractors, obviously, your administrative team. So if you were going to set up a call center to deal with media queries and public queries, who's going to take those calls? Who's going to give them the script of what to say? What calls need to be filtered up to the crisis team? So that team needs training and templates for use during the response phase. And the last thing, I'll show you two more things. It's a very useful exercise for you to sit down and say, right, who are our key stakeholders? Now, that's just a kind of a generic one again. You'll have internal, so emergencies generally have an internal kind of focus. You know, you can have a small emergency on site. People outside the organization may not know about it. So that's internal. When you have a crisis, you need to start communicating externally. And these are critical stakeholders, you know. Emergency services, your banks, insurers, politicians, your staff, obviously, and their relatives would be critical. The media, that'd be critical from a communications perspective. And you can change that up to match your local circumstances, if you like, or your organizational circumstances. Now, the last thing I'll show you is this slide here on exercises. So I've said to you, exercises are a means to practice your teams becoming proficient in the implementation of the plan and the deployment of whatever resources are available. And there's 3 levels of exercise, basically. You have a workshop. And as you can see there, workshop is the basic. It's the start point. If you have a new plan, if you have a new team, no recent emergencies, you have new procedures or new leadership team, you're moving to a new facility, start off very basic. Explain the plan to people. Tabletop exercises, 2 levels, basic and advanced. It's a practice session. You set a scenario and you set a task for the team. It's discussion based. It stays in the room. There's no need for external communications. You promote familiarity with the plan. You tell people to refer to the plan and implement particular procedures. You assess the plan for coverage, etc. As you can see, all those ones there. And the one on the right then is the one you're aiming at. So every couple of years or whatever, you try and do a live exercise where you might deploy all the resources. You run it in real time. You'd have the phones hopping that the call takers have to take calls. You'd see how that filters up to the team. You force them to make decisions under duress. And again, you're not throwing them in the deep end. You've built them up to that level of competency through the previous 2 levels of exercise. Now, I just want to thank you for your patience, and I want to thank Chrissy and Mark for the invite. And I'm not sure how long we were time-wise, but we certainly have a few minutes left there for questions. So back over to you there, Chrissy, and I'll just turn off the screen share.
Yeah, we do indeed. We've got some time. And thanks so much, John. That was really, really interesting. I can see here from the chat on the right-hand side that people were finding that really informative. Guys, if you do have any questions, go ahead and pop them in now. I know Mark's probably going to join us now in a second too. While he's doing that, we did have one question in already from Paul. He's asking, regarding communication, is there a golden rule which large organizations can adopt to control over communication from their own staff, which may worsen the crisis?
Well, that's an interesting point. Not that I'm aware of the answer, Paul. Again, we will work with the maxim. You can't over communicate. People want to know what's going on. Internally, there are different scenarios I could run by you. For example, let's say there's an industrial accident and you have a fatality. Okay, staff members will be aware who was injured. However, when that fatality is confirmed to you, you now have a choice, and it's different in different jurisdictions, by the way. So in the UK, for example, statutorily, it's the police who inform the next of kin. That's not the case, we'd say, here in Ireland. So a company could take a decision to inform somebody of that fact. Now, that can take a lot longer than you think. And your staff will be putting you under pressure saying, we want to know how John Brophy is. We know he was injured. and you're not in a position to update them to release that information before their next of kin would be informed, for example. So communications comes with all sorts of challenges. And again, the team is always, particularly in the early stages, Paul, your team is always slightly behind the wave because you're gathering the information, you're trying to develop the situational awareness, particularly in physical type of emergencies. You're trying to process that and make decisions on it. And one of those decisions is what and how to communicate with staff.
John, I think we've lost your sound there. Mark, can you hear John? You can? Okay, cool.
Can you hear me again now, Chrissy?
Yeah, I got you. It must have been just on my own computer because Mark could still hear you.
Okay, apologies for that. So there's no golden rule, and it's I would take the advice of a PR or communication specialist on a team at that point.
Yeah, good answer. If anyone else has any questions, go ahead and pop them in. Mark, would you like to say a few words?
I was just going to say, I think it's a good point that Paul made, because I think we've all had situations where, unless it's clear who should be communicating and how that process works, often very well-meaning people who are involved at a senior level end up being caught to talk and to make statements and stuff. And I think what Paul's alluding to is quite right, in that can be wholly counterproductive because they won't be briefed, they won't be practiced. And you can, again, as a decent person just caught on the spot, you can say things that don't help. John, one of the reasons I wanted to jump on was I wanted to ask you something very specific. And of course, should have known better. Forgive me, I have a cold. I think I sound funny. Your last slide kind of covered off what I was going to ask, but I want to ask a version of it anyway, because a lot of the time when we do training around emergency stuff and exercising and testing your plans, there's a focus on tabletops. And we get it, and we understand why, and we know the value in them. And you talk about a program of exercising where maybe once every few years you do a live exercise. And again, on that last slide, tabletops were in there, and then there was workshops. So feel free to tell me the answer is what's on the slide, Mark. But I just wanted to check in, because it's something we're asked regularly, is other than those types of maybe headline type of workshops, exercises, that kind of thing, is there anything else we should be doing to constantly be progressing our plans, testing them? Are there simpler, more regular, more frequent ways to test these things?
Absolutely, there are. Your plan is the culmination of a set of procedures, right? It's the management of everything that you have going on, right? Now, you should constantly be doing drills. For example, the difference between a drill and an exercise or a test, a drill tests or practices one specific procedure. So, for example, statutorily, everybody is required to do an annual fire drill or 2 drills per shift per annum, whatever. That's a specific procedure. Set off the alarm. How do people get out of the building? How do we account for them? Now, here's what happens usually. Everyone is told, oh, by the way, Mark, we're having a fire alarm test on Tuesday, 12 o'clock, we're going to do the full drill. So everyone is aware that that's happening. They don't set any meetings for a Tuesday at 12 o'clock, etc., etc. And everybody goes out the very same door and down the same staircase and out through the same exit door they've come in through for the last 15 years. If you want to drill that properly, don't tell people there's a fire drill. Tell the key people that you need within your emergency management structure. Set off your fire alarm. Put somebody in a high-vis jacket standing at one of the exits and say, sorry, folks, you cannot come out this way. This hallway is full of smoke or whatever. Find another way out of the building. And you'd be surprised at the number of people who then they stop dead and go, oh, I always come in this way. I don't know any. And they start following everybody else. Okay. Practice somebody as part of that drill in making a 999 call. Now, they don't have to ring the services. You can drill that. You can have somebody with a script who's ready for it, because that call is standard. I did an exercise last week in which it was a requirement of the organization to call all 3 emergency services. Right? Now, how long do you think that phone call took?
I'd imagine, based on you bringing it up, longer than we all expected.
Exactly. That call took 12 minutes. and 39 seconds, because each time you make that call, the emergency service you're calling is hearing it for the first time. And they'll all ask you the same question: exact location, type. So the E10 mnemonic that we use: exact location, type of emergency, hazards presence, access routes, emergency services required. They will talk you through that. They'll get a name and contact number from you in each case. If you're using, for example, say somebody, a key member of your team, to make, say you make the call to the services, that person's out of the picture for 12 or 15 minutes during a crucial period. If you're using the security guard on the front gate of a premises in the control hut where the team is initially meeting, that guy's on the phone, or that person's on the phone for, tied up completely. So you unless you drill those procedures independently. Here's another one. If you're on a crisis management team, your crisis management team coordinator should be drilling the activation of that team quarterly, every second quarter, normal working hours, and then at a weekend or outside of normal working hours. And that's just a drill, and it just involves the following. If you're using text message or WhatsApp or something like Everbridge notification system, you send a message. This is an exercise or test message. If the crisis team were activated now, are you available? Will you be joining online? Can you make your way to the premises? Yes or no? You answer that and say, thank you very much. No further action required. That keeps it in the back of people's heads. I'm on this team. I could get a call at any stage. Now, if you have a half a bottle of red wine in you on a Friday night at 9 o'clock and you get the call, you just say, well, I'm not available, or I could only join online, or I'll have to get a taxi, whatever. But I have a few drinks on board. Maybe you want to get my alternate or deputy. And if you do those drills over a period of time, you will get a very clear picture of how much of your team you're likely to get in an out-of-hours scenario or a normal working hours scenario. So there are drills, which are the basic level that you can do internally. There are all the levels of exercises. Now, people always want the live, it's great fun, and there's a huge dynamic to it. Here's the danger of jumping to a live exercise. So best practice says you do a progressive exercise program. You build up the skills and competencies. You practice the information managers, etc., etc. And then when they've worked through those, they're in a position now that they're not going to be phased by having an awful lot of information thrown at them in real time, because they now understand the characteristics. They understand the process to process the information and distill it and present it and what to prioritize. Whereas if you jump to that point, here's what can happen. You can frighten people. You will annoy people. You will have a manager who does not want to be exposed or asked a tough question in front of his or her peers, because they may not have the answer. And now they feel, well, you made an idiot out of me. You didn't ask Mark that question. You know what I mean? You made Chrissy look good and Mark looked, and they don't want to and they'll disengage from the exercise program or future training. So you need to be really careful and bring people along and build competence, build confidence, build experience and knowledge.
I get you. No, that's a good point. We've had an experience with kind of probably jumping to the tabletop too early, in that, being very honest, the first, there was only supposed to be one, it ended up being two, because the first one pretty much turned into a training type thing. Okay. Because everyone was, thankfully, straight up going, I don't even know how to deal with that now. What do? We need to dig into the documents. Let's figure it out. So we had to use that first tabletop as training, and then go into a second tabletop subsequently.
Yeah. I'll give you another example, Mark, if I may now, right? So we did an exercise maybe a year or 18 months ago in the National Emergency Coordination Centre here. And it was a challenging exercise, and we put out part of a scenario, and there was a period of confusion, right? Now, somebody said to me afterwards, listen, you were facilitating that exercise just as part of feedback, right? And feedback is brilliant. You love feedback. Yeah. I feel you should have stood in at that point when things got a little bit chaotic as the exercise facilitator. And my answer to him was, I'm very sorry. This is the National Emergency Coordination Centre. This is not a training session. This is an exercise. If you come in here, we expect that you are competent and prepared for your role and function representing your department. So it's not my job to train you here. This is a practice session. And you must understand, confusion and a little bit of chaos is usually part of the problem. The reason there are plans and exercise is to minimize the confusion and the chaos. So it's good experience.
You want to have the opportunity to work through that when it comes up, not be saved from it and move past it.
Exactly that. You don't want to protect, you want to protect people by saying, I'm not going to put you into an exercise where I am going to expose you or embarrass you.
Yeah.
I'm going to train you to the point where you will be well able to deal whatever is thrown at you with an exercise. And there's a way that you can build that up. And you don't have to be doing exercises every week or every month or every quarter. You need an annual program running over a couple of years, 2.5 years, building towards a live exercise, ideally.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think how people come into those exercises, the frame of mind they're in, is really important. Because I'd say we've all seen the versions where, as you say, people are suspicious of it. I'm going to be made look silly. I work with these people every day. I need to make sure I don't look like a fool.
Right. Yeah.
Which and again, is this your experience? I have found that in organizations that are permanent, are set, where you would go in and do these exercises, where everyone knows each other, work with each other day in, day out, that can be a real issue. I have found that when we do them for events, large-scale events, where partners are brought together just for that event, and maybe we work on a few together, but like, we're here in this room just for this event. We're not day-to-day, every day of the year colleagues. Yeah. I find that people are in a better headspace to go, there's an expectation that, look, maybe you haven't got to all the documents yet. We all need time to bed in here. So if you don't know the answer, I have found that in the event industry, we're a little bit quicker to go, fucking no idea. I haven't got to that yet. What do we do? Talk me through that. Yeah. Rather than kind of bullshit their way through it, which is the worst thing you can have happen, I think.
Exactly. No, and once you get multiple different organizations or multiple agencies, do you know what I mean? You can handle your own agency or organization because people know each other, and there's a bit of comfort in the familiarity, and there could be a bit of discomfort if I feel I'm going to be embarrassed in front of somebody, which is where the facilitation comes in. You make sure that doesn't happen. But once you get interagency stuff, things get more complex. None of those agencies wants to look bad in front of the others, but they're all experts, and they need to be reminded something. Well, you're the expert in this field. We take your advice, like. So we're not trying to catch you. You just tell us what you think, and if you need something from us, you know the way in a lot of events, there's a handover of primacy. For example, in a major incident where you then put the resources you have at the disposal of the services. So they need to know what resources you have. And if they haven't engaged or participated in development of the plan for large-scale events, they're not going to know that. And here's a good question to always ask in an exercise. Have you read the plan? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I want you to think to yourself, have you read the plan? You don't need to know that plan off by heart. Nobody's going to question you on it. But if you haven't read it, you're not going to know what's in it. You're not going to know what's useful. You're not going to leverage it. And you'll be operating on the fly, which is not what we want. We want your experience. We want your expertise. But we also want you to know the structures and the checklists that we expect that you will use.
I'm pretty sure I've never been in an exercise with you where it hasn't started with that question. You're triggering memories here now of the times I sat there going, I actually haven't read that. No, it's interesting. I do think it's a topic that a lot of people are interested in. I know there were groups of 5 and 6 that were on or could still be here. I know some of them had to go on the session today, coming from the same organization who I know, like they're large organizations. They're in lots of events. They have a lot of challenges. And I'm keen that we do, and in the industry, we all do as much as we can to kind of demystify any fear people still have about just testing, exercising, because it's 100% not about catching ourselves. It's not about catching individuals out. It is, for me, about catching any stumbling blocks or things that aren't clear to certain stakeholders. And that's your opportunity to test them, clear them up before the real thing might happen.
Yeah. Now, testing is an interesting word because an exercise, what I've said is an exercise is a practice session to practice people doing the right things. If you take it seriously and you engage in the spirit of it, you can identify lessons. You can then build those lessons in to make it a lesson learned, right? A test is a pass or fail. So, for example, with the technology side of things, say the business continuity, the disaster recovery, you can test systems, technological systems. Will that system be able to transfer over and I can recover everything back to the last backup point, which is an hour ago? Do you follow me? That's a test, and it's a pass or fail, but it's not a test of a person or an individual.
Yeah, and I think that's often what's missed, and people get really caught up. And I think in those are in when you bring statutory agencies into it, I think it changes that dynamic. And I get that their day-to-day environment is different to the event people they're in the room with. So that's often, as you've probably seen, where you can have 2 different types of people in the room.
Yeah,
where some are really suspicious of it, and some of us are used to them quite regularly. We get it. We
Yeah.
want the others to engage, and it doesn't. I often say I enjoy delivering them. I think there's a great skill in delivering them well, which I'm not sure I'm particularly good at, but we do them sometimes. I think people like you, other people that do these kind of professionally, there's a great skill in getting the most out of it when you're dealing with so many different people with different approaches, different levels of understanding and suspicion. I always think that skill and people who kind of are very good at that are worth having in an organization if they can.
Mark, it's more important than you think now, right? Because let's go for the worst case scenario. There's a fatalities, we'll say multiple fatalities at an event. That will end up in a courtroom or an official inquiry somewhere. And I can tell you now, you could make it. If I asked you, what questions do you think they're going to be, a guy or a person in a wig? And they'll ask you the following questions. What training did you have in relation to preparing for this event? And you can give a great answer and say, okay, who trained you? Who was the person who trained you? What qualifications or training did they have in order to be able to train you in it?
Yeah.
And you can be made look very foolish by a skilled wordsmith who is a barrister, because they can know the question to ask to get the answer that they want.
and that's what they're paid to do. It's interesting. I was delivering a day of training yesterday for an event company here in Dublin. And we got into that thing, which we talk a lot about in our diploma course, which is what we call that defendable position.
Yes.
So it's not something you stress over on a daily basis, but it underpins everything you do, how you set your processes up, how you do your training, all of that. It's in that sense that it should stand to me if I'm ever in front of a judge, which is the easiest way for people to think of it. But what I found myself reminding the group yesterday frequently of is, in reality, most times, unless it's, as you say, fatalities and stuff, most times these things don't get to a judge. They get to insurance companies who then bring in expert witnesses. And I was explaining yesterday that an expert witness, to do the least amount of work thoroughly, but to do the least amount of work and make the most amount of money, they're going to ask for all your paperwork. They're going to review all your systems and procedures. They're going to see you did an exercise. They'll be looking for John Brophy's bona fides to have delivered it. And if they can just ask a load of questions on paper, poke a load of holes and stuff, that doesn't even get to a judge. That's insurance companies then paying out, causing all the problems because you haven't set yourself up for success.
Correct.
You don't have a training record or a
exactly.
exercise record. And
and
we can often let ourselves down.
Their first job is
good work, but not documented.
Their first job is to try and discredit you.
Yeah.
Or find that weakness, and then you're on the back foot,
Yeah. And that's not a personal thing. Again, that is literally their job, is to try and discredit you or your program or whatever it is. So, I mean, there's a lot to it if you were to focus on it, and we might all get a bit too depressed about the potentials here. But I think it's just about underpinning how you operate. It's not stress every day because something bad might happen. Let's be honest. In my game, if I was to stress every day about the worst thing that can happen at our shows, I wouldn't do it. Like, the risk is significant.
Yeah. So the question then comes back to, and this is what will happen again with insurers in court, is what you did reasonable? Yeah. Now, can you put your hand on your heart and say, look, what we did was reasonable in the circumstance. We did this, we engaged the agencies, we developed a plan, and we tested or rehearsed that plan with people, and then we tweaked it to make sure that the lessons learned were built back into it. And we continuously do that in a system of creeping excellence where we review every incident that occurred. You know, like I did a debrief last year now after following a major incident. So it was an interagency debrief, a lot of agencies. And people are always a little bit defensive, like, you know, so the first thing you say is, look, I'm not your enemy, like, you know, I'm here to help you identify some things that you might want to change. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And again, a good point to say to people in debrief is say, you're lucky that I'm the person standing here asking the questions and that you're not sitting in a dock somewhere with a person in a wig and a gown asking you the same questions. You know? Yeah, fair point. Yeah. But listen, just for me, I know Chrissy probably needs us to wrap up. I just wanted to jump on and tease things out a little bit on that front, because a lot of it was fresh for me with the session I did yesterday. So for me, thank you again. I'm always glad when you come in and do exercise first and when you give of your time to do stuff like this. I think there's great value in it for the industry. And Chrissy, thank you for organizing it and getting the time that suited and everything. Well, thank you both. Thanks very much, Chrissy. Thanks, Mark. And thanks to all the lovely participants that I haven't seen nor spoken to, but I hope you heard me okay. Thanks, Dad. Thank you very much. Thank you, folks. Bye-bye.